Hey guys! Tonight, we begin with something very relatable: sleep, or more accurately how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By day, a castle was an orchestra of noise. The clang of blacksmith hammers in the courtyard, the stomp of boots across stone floors polished smooth by generations of hurried feet, the scrape of wooden benches across the great hall, the rustle of silks brushing against the simpler wool of servants. You could hardly hear yourself think over the hawkers outside the gates selling onions and eels, the echoing shouts of guards changing watch, and the dogs barking at everything that dared move. But after the last torch in the outer yard guttered and the courtyard emptied of its daytime chaos, the castle shifted. It did not go silent, not truly, but its sounds changed, became smaller, more secretive, almost hesitant, as if the castle itself was aware of the darkness, aware of the sleeping nobles, aware of the whispering plots it had overheard for centuries. The servants became part of that darkness, moving with the caution of those who knew they might be punished for being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time. The narrow servants' passages, built like veins through the body of the fortress, came alive at night. They were dark, twisting tunnels that allowed someone to travel from the kitchens to the Lord's chamber without ever setting foot in the main corridors. A new servant, unfamiliar with these routes, might get lost, wander into a dead end, and discover an unlit stairwell leading nowhere. An experienced servant could navigate them in total darkness, knowing by memory which stone underfoot was slightly loose, which turn smelled faintly of mildew, which corner hid a spy hole into the solar. The nobles upstairs believed themselves safe in their chambers. They had their great doors of oak, their bedchambers high above the courtyard, their guards stationed in the halls outside. But the truth was, the walls around them were full of holes. Not literal gaps large enough for an enemy to climb through, but hidden slits, listening shafts, and staircases so narrow you could only ascend sideways. A tapestry might hide a door so flush to the wall you'd never guess it existed, unless you'd once seen a hand emerge from behind it. The stone of the walls changed character in the night, too. In the day it was proud and impenetrable. At night it was damp and restless, weeping cold droplets that clung to your fingertips if you touched it. The sound of water dripping somewhere far away could echo for minutes. Beneath your feet, deep in the bowels of the castle, cisterns caught rainwater, and their constant, quiet trickle was a reminder that even in sleep the castle was awake, working. The kitchens never truly closed. Even at midnight, you might find a scullery maid in the dim light of the hearth, gnawing the last meat from a chicken bone meant for the Lord's hounds, or a cook making a pie for the next day's meal while pretending not to listen to the hushed argument between two guards by the doorway. Cats prowled along the tables, looking for anything the rats had not already claimed. And the rats, fat from the feasts of the great, moved boldly through the darkness, brushing past skirts and boots without fear. Somewhere above, in a chamber lit by no more than a single candle, two people might be speaking too softly for anyone to hear their words, but their posture would tell everything. The forward lean, the flicker of eyes toward the door, the slight tremble in the hand holding a wine goblet. One might be pledging loyalty, the other demanding proof. Or perhaps it was a tryst. Those happened, too. A queen's lady-in-waiting and a knight sworn to another's service. A servant and a stable boy who thought no one noticed. Sometimes these meetings were harmless. Sometimes they ended in betrayal that would ripple through the castle for months. The guards on night duty were not immune to temptation. A little gold, a whispered promise, and suddenly the portcullis was raised just an inch at an hour when it should have been sealed tight. Someone might slip inside, a messenger carrying news not meant for the king's ears. Or someone might slip out, vanishing into the night before anyone realized they were gone. The architecture of the castle itself encouraged intrigue. Staircases spiraled in tight turns so two people meeting halfway could not help but brush against each other. Window seats, deep enough to curl into, became perfect listening posts. A single candle placed in a window might be a signal to someone in the village below. A lover, a co-conspirator, a hired killer. Even the air smelled different at night. The lingering scent of roasted boar from the evening feast mixed with the sharp tang of tallow candles, the earthy dampness of stone, the faint sweetness of crushed herbs left out to dry in the kitchen. The smells drifted through the corridors, mingling with the faint traces of perfume from a lady's chamber, or the bitter sting of iron from the armory. and all the while the castle listened. It stored the sounds and scents and sights of the night in its memory, the way an old man collects stories to tell much later. It knew who met in secret, who moved silently through forbidden passages, who returned to their chambers smelling of someone else's bed. Down in the stables, the grooms whispered their own theories of the night's movements. Which knight's horse had been saddled after the moon was high? Which lady had asked for her palfrey to be readied for a ride in the fresh air well past midnight? The stable cats, just as silent as the servants, hunted mice between the hooves of restless horses. In the servants' quarters, stories spread fast, sometimes truth, sometimes fiction, always laced with enough detail to make you doubt you could dismiss them. Someone swore the kitchen ghost had been seen again, pale and dripping wet, walking toward the wine cellar. No one went down there alone after dark. Others whispered of strange lights in the abandoned tower, where no one had slept in decades. By the time the first cockcrow sounded from the village beyond the walls, the night's games were over. Lovers retreated to their beds. Messengers slipped back into the shadows. The guards pretended they had been vigilant all along. And the castle, its stones damp, its halls empty, held its secrets a little longer. Because in a castle after dark, nothing was entirely private, and nothing was ever entirely forgotten. By day, the castle's corridors are stone arteries of politics and procedure, servants sweeping, guards clanking, the cold echo of boots on flagstones announcing order. But after dark, when torches flicker low and the air thickens with the scent of tallow, the halls become something else entirely. They begin to whisper. Some say it's the wind. The old masons would disagree. They would tell you that castles, especially the old ones, were built with 1,000 tiny listening points. Narrow slits in the walls that didn't quite lead to the outside, hollow spaces inside stone pillars, deliberately crafted to carry sound. The great families didn't simply want to rule, they wanted to hear. And so the architecture itself became a conspirator. If you stood in the right alcove in the south hall of a 13th century keep, you could hear a conversation in the private solar 2 floors above. Not perfectly, no sound always arrives tangled, but enough to catch a name, a promise, a number of coins. The clever steward, the one whose smile reached no higher than his mouth, would stand there in the evenings pretending to check the wall hangings. In truth, he was gathering the whispers that became currency. Of course, the people who lived here learned to suspect the walls. They'd lower their voices to a murmur, or sometimes speak in riddles no eavesdropper could untangle. The Duke of Alsbrecht was famous for this. He would discuss troop movements in the form of a love poem, so that if someone overheard, they'd assume it was just idle romance. "Your eyes are the eastern gate," he'd say, guarded by 100 loyal watchmen, and only his captain of arms knew that meant secure the east tower with 100 men by dawn. But in the deep of night, when formality has long since retired to its chambers, the whispers are rarely about troop movements. They are about longing, desire, fear, the kind of secrets that cannot survive daylight. In the countess's chamber, her ladies-in-waiting would untie their hair and speak freely, the way women do when the world outside is asleep. One confessed she had fallen in love with a stable boy, a dangerous admission, for such a match could ruin her position. Another admitted she had been slipping extra bread to a prisoner in the dungeon, not because she pitied him, but because his eyes were the kind one could drown in. And the countess, who pretended to be scandalized, listened with the quiet hunger of someone who collected other people's risks like jewels. Down in the kitchens, the scene was warmer, louder, but no less ripe with intrigue. The night cooks, relieved from the eye of the head chef, would share scraps of information with as much relish as they shared scraps of roasted meat. They knew who had been caught leaving whose chamber. They knew which noble's wine was watered, and which cask was reserved for bribes. They knew always when a servant was dismissed not for laziness, but because they knew too much. And then there were the places where the whispers stopped altogether. Not out of ignorance, but out of reverence. The small chapel in the east wing, for example. It was said the stone altar had been built over a much older shrine, and the monks who tended it knew more about the castle's past than any lord. They prayed for the souls of men who had not yet died. They prayed for deals not yet made. It was not a place for gossip, but for the kind of silence that carried more weight than words. In the great hall, a different sort of murmuring took place. At night, when all was cleared but the trestle tables, the hall was a space for quiet strategy between allies, or enemies pretending to be allies. Merchants from the city might meet with the castle's treasurer in the glow of the hearth, discussing future shipments, in voices so low they were almost lost in the crackle of logs. No one mentioned the word contraband, but both knew the meaning was there. And then, of course, there were the clandestine meetings that did not take place in halls at all, but in the cold, hidden staircases winding between floors. There, pressed between stone and shadow, lovers met with hearts thundering so loud they were sure it could be heard in the courtyard below. A knight would unbuckle his sword belt with fumbling fingers, a lady would let her silk train slip to the floor, and for a brief, breathless moment, the world outside ceased to exist. These staircases kept their secrets well, until a dropped glove, or a misplaced shoe, told its silent story the next morning. The architecture of the castle was a maze of such secrets. Some corridors led nowhere, designed solely to confuse intruders. Others looped back into themselves, perfect for pacing while you argued quietly with a co-conspirator. And the tapestries, oh, the tapestries were more than decoration. They softened sound, yes, but they also concealed niches large enough for a man to stand in, waiting, sometimes to listen, sometimes to leap. It is tempting, from the comfort of the present day, to imagine these whispers as romantic, charming things, the stuff of courtly love and dramatic poetry. And sometimes they were. But just as often, the whispered word was a weapon. A rumor loosed into the air could ruin a family in a fortnight. A single overheard sentence could send a man to the gallows. The game of whispers was as deadly as any battle fought with steel. The truly skilled players of this game were never caught speaking more than they needed to. They traded in glances, in the lift of an eyebrow, in the pause before a reply. They could make a promise without moving their lips. They could seal an alliance with a shared look over a goblet of wine. And the most dangerous among them could make you believe you had come to the idea yourself, all while planting it neatly in your mind. In the end, the castle at night was not silent. It only pretended to be. Beneath the quiet lay a constant, murmuring tide of wants and warnings, bargains and betrayals. Every torch gutter, every distant footstep, every shift of fabric in the dark was another voice in the chorus. The question was never whether the castle was speaking, it was whether you were clever enough to understand what it was saying. And perhaps that is the greatest secret of all. In a castle after dark, the walls do not just have ears, they have opinions. If you wandered the castle corridors after midnight, past the feasting hall where the candles still smoldered in half-melted pools of wax, you would eventually find yourself near the guardroom, that liminal space between the Lord's inner chambers and the cold world outside. It was not quite the barracks, not quite the dining hall, but a strange hybrid of both. Here, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and that damp, mineral smell of stone that never fully dried, no matter how large the fire burned. The guards themselves were an odd fraternity. They were not knights. Knights were ornamental peacocks in plate armor who performed heroic duties mostly in daylight and on horseback. Guards were something else entirely. They were the ones who kept the doors bolted, the gates locked, and the secrets contained. They were mercenaries, former soldiers, younger sons of poor families, or wanderers who found themselves tethered to the castle like barnacles to a ship. They worked in shifts, which meant there was always someone awake, a quiet insurance policy against both intruders and inconvenient truths. After dark, the guardroom became the unofficial repository for everything overheard, seen, or guessed at. No one in the castle knew more than the guards. They heard the muffled arguments between the lord and lady through the thick oak doors. They saw the quick exchange of letters between the lady-in-waiting and the visiting minstrel. They noticed which chambermaids slipped into whose quarters and which cloaks were missing from their hooks after midnight. And, crucially, they never spoke of it to the wrong people, but they did speak of it to each other. It wasn't all malicious gossip. Some of it was survival. In a place where alliances shifted like candle flames in a draft, knowing who was angry, who was plotting, and who was suddenly absent could mean the difference between life and death. If the captain of the guard heard of a midnight meeting in the chapel, he made sure his men were stationed in the right corridor, not to intervene necessarily, but to know, to witness, to remember. The guardroom's main table was perpetually cluttered, tankards half full of ale, the crusts of coarse bread, dice, a few battered playing cards with corners so frayed they curled. By candlelight, the guards played games that were as much about conversation as about winning. A roll of the dice could prompt a story of a siege survived, a lover betrayed, a comrade lost to winter frostbite. But more often than not, the conversation would drift back to the people sleeping or not sleeping in the floors above them. On certain nights, a serving girl would pass through, bringing food for the night watch. Sometimes she lingered, leaning against the doorframe as the men traded barbs. If she was in the mood, She might share her own slivers of overheard conversation from the kitchen or the laundry. The guards knew how to coax these morsels out of her without making it obvious. A casual "what's kept you so late?" or "who's missing from supper tonight?" could unlock a flood of detail. Then there were the nights when the guardroom was quieter than usual, when the air seemed charged with something unspoken. Those were the nights after a scandal, after a lord's unexpected absence, a lady's unexplained fainting, or a noble guest departing sooner than planned. On such nights, the dice lay untouched. The guards would sit in companionable silence, drinking more than they spoke, each man holding his own theories but knowing better than to speak them aloud too soon. The most guarded of all guards, however, was not a man but the castle's master key, a heavy iron object that lived in a locked chest in the corner of the room. This key could open nearly any door in the keep. It was never to be removed without the captain's order, and yet there were rumors, never proven, that on certain nights it did leave its resting place. No one ever admitted to using it, but in the guardroom, the key was the silent witness to every midnight venture that bypassed the usual routes. Beyond the guardroom door, the courtyard lay in shadows. The moonlit cobblestones gleamed pale, and the night air carried the scent of horses, hay, and the faint, metallic tang of the smithy's tools cooling in the dark. Out here, guards on patrol moved in slow, measured arcs, checking gates and listening for sounds that didn't belong. The creak of a rope, the splash of water in the moat, the footstep too light to be theirs. They were not always looking for enemies. Sometimes they were ensuring that certain guests reached their chambers without being noticed, or that the wrong eyes did not witness a lady slipping into the chapel for a clandestine meeting. In this way, the guards were both protectors and facilitators of the castle's intrigues. The older guards liked to tell newcomers that the real danger in a castle was not on the battlefield, but in the corridors. You could avoid arrows and swords with armor and training, but avoid an overheard word at the wrong moment? That was almost impossible, and in the delicate web of alliances and betrayals that made up the castle's social life, being implicated was as deadly as being stabbed. It was also in the guardroom that certain coded arrangements were made. A discreet knock on the door, the exchange of a small pouch, and suddenly a man's patrol route changed, placing him conveniently far from a specific tower at a specific time. Whether he was avoiding trouble or enabling, it was not for him to say. In castles, plausible deniability was worth more than gold. Every now and then, when the fire burned low and the youngest of the guards began to nod off, one of the veterans would lean back and say, "Remember the night the Baron's guest never came back from the stables?" The story would unspool again, half truth, half invention, about a visiting nobleman last seen walking into the mist, and the quiet panic that rippled through the castle at dawn. What actually happened was anyone's guess, but the fact remained. The guards had seen more than they would ever admit, and so the guardroom was both a sanctuary and a stage. By day, it was simply a room where men prepared for shifts, sharpened swords, and oiled armor. But after dark, it became the nerve center of the castle's hidden life, the place where whispers were collected, filtered, and filed away for possible future use. Because in a medieval castle, knowledge was not just power, it was currency, and the guards, for all their rough edges and lowly pay, were often the richest men in the building. Not in silver or gold, but in the dangerous, intoxicating wealth of knowing what really happened after dark. Deep within the sprawling stone labyrinth of a medieval castle were chambers that guests rarely saw. These were not grand halls or welcoming parlors. They were the spaces kept deliberately in shadow, both physically and in memory. A lord might happily lead you through his banqueting hall, past tapestries and gleaming tableware, but he would never invite you up the narrow spiral to certain upper floors, nor down the silent steps into the belly of the castle. These were the forbidden rooms, places of secrecy, control, and in some cases, quiet danger. Let us begin with the tower chambers, small, high, and locked from within. Officially, they were sometimes used to store valuables. Gold coins in carved chests, the lord's personal weapons, bolts of cloth. But when the sun went down, these rooms became holding places for living valuables, hostages, prisoners of importance, or occasionally, an inconvenient relative. The medieval night was long and alliances fragile. A political rival who arrived as a guest could find themselves escorted to a tower for their own safety, the door barred behind them. Below ground, the atmosphere changed entirely. The air grew cold and damp, and the walls sweated in the torchlight. The castle's undercroft and cellars had their respectable uses, storing barrels of ale, salted meats, and sacks of grain. But they also contained rooms whose doors were deliberately heavy, whose windows were nothing more than narrow slits. In these lower chambers, secrets could be kept in perfect silence. A prisoner brought here after dark would find their sense of time quickly dissolve. The absence of light, the thick smell of earth and mildew, the slow drip of unseen water, it stripped away the hours. A guard's torch passing by might be the only proof the world above still existed. But the forbidden rooms were not all about punishment. Some served as spaces for forbidden pleasures. Lords and ladies had private chambers far away from the bustle of the servants' quarters. Rooms reached through hidden doors in the wood paneling or through back staircases known only to trusted attendants. In these rooms, after dark, business and propriety could be left outside. Lovers could meet here, free from the formalities of court. Trusted musicians could be brought in quietly to play for a very select audience. Candles would be lit low, wine poured generously, and the laughter here was not the polite kind heard in the great hall. It was quieter, freer, edged with risk. Some of these hidden spaces weren't even obvious rooms at all. Behind certain fireplaces, there were narrow passages. Inside thick walls, there might be hidden staircases. These secret routes allowed the lord or lady to move about unseen, perhaps to visit a favored guest without alerting the rest of the household. They could also serve as escape routes in times of danger. A ruler who could vanish from their chamber at a moment's notice held an advantage both in politics and in romance. In castles of great wealth, there might be entire suites devoted to secrecy. Rooms with no windows, cushioned floors, thick curtains, and locks on both sides of the door. Some were used for private councils, where the sound of voices would not carry. Others were devoted to storage of objects too dangerous or precious for the main treasury. Strange relics brought back from far-off campaigns, documents whose contents could ruin reputations, or even poisons, kept carefully under guard. Of course, the servants knew more than anyone else. It was the servants who brought meals to the locked rooms, who emptied chamber pots from the undercroft cells, who lit the candles in the hidden chambers. Their loyalty or their silence was a valuable currency. Sometimes, an ambitious servant could trade such knowledge for favor. At other times, loose talk could mean their disappearance into one of those very same rooms. The atmosphere of these forbidden spaces was unlike anywhere else in the castle. The air seemed heavier, the walls closer. A person walking here at night might hear their own footsteps echo strangely, as if someone else were following. In the flicker of torchlight, stonework seemed to move, and shadows formed shapes that lingered too long. In a world without electric light, darkness was not merely the absence of sight. It was an active presence, one that could feel almost alive. The idea of a locked door carried a different weight in the Middle Ages. Today, a locked room might protect valuables from theft. Then, it might just as easily keep something or someone inside. A castle might have dozens of locked spaces, each with its own key held only by the lord, his steward, or his most trusted guard. And keys themselves were power. To be given a key to a forbidden room was not simply a practical matter. It was a mark of status, of trust, sometimes of dangerous intimacy. After dark, the boundaries between the permissible and the forbidden blurred even further. A meeting in a locked chamber might be political, personal, or both. An intercepted whisper could change the course of alliances. And in the deep of night, when the castle seemed to sleep, the true life of these forbidden rooms often began. Quiet conversations, hurried visits, plans made over candlelight. The stone walls did not speak of what they saw, but they remembered. Some travelers' accounts hint at what might be found in such rooms. A merchant writing in the late 14th century described being escorted past a series of doors, each more heavily bolted than the last, until he was brought into a chamber hung with silk and smelling faintly of rosewater. There, he met not the lord who had summoned him, but the lord's wife, who wished to conduct a private negotiation away from her husband's ears. He left with a pouch of silver and a warning not to mention the meeting. Another chronicler tells of a castle in France where one room was kept locked for decades, its contents known only to the reigning lord. When at last the door was opened, it revealed a collection of skulls, each with a name carved into the bone. Whether such stories were truth, embellishment, or deliberate rumor, they all served the same purpose: to remind anyone entering a castle that behind the public face of grandeur and hospitality, there were private worlds, worlds with their own rules, their own dangers, and their own shadows. And after dark, the path to these worlds was open only to those who knew where to knock, and who could be trusted not to tell what they had seen. The forbidden rooms were more than just spaces. They were symbols of the castle's hidden life. They represented control, secrecy, and the delicate balance between trust and fear. And as the moonlight slanted through narrow windows high in the towers, somewhere behind a locked door, Another piece of the castle's midnight intrigue was unfolding. In daylight, power in a medieval castle was clear, written in stone as much as it was in bloodline. You could tell who was in charge by the height of their seat, the richness of their fabrics, the way lesser men bowed when they passed. But at night, when the shadows swallowed heraldry and the great hall was no longer a stage for ceremony, power took on a far slipperier form. And it was in this softer, flickering realm that the most dangerous games were played. The nobles called it courtly life, the servants called it survival. Every glance, every jest, every idle word shared under the glow of torches could shift alliances or undo a reputation that had taken decades to build. Here, power wasn't in swords but in whispers, not in decrees but in subtle gestures. A touch to a sleeve, a raised eyebrow across the hall, the careful way one ignored another's existence entirely. Evenings after the feast often slid into smaller gatherings in solar chambers or private halls. A lord might host a handful of chosen companions, nobles, a favored minstrel, perhaps a foreign envoy. There, surrounded by cushions and goblets, they'd talk politics in the same tone they discussed hunting or poetry. And yet, each word was weighed like coin. You could promise a marriage alliance without ever saying the word marriage. You could end a trade deal with nothing more than a well-timed yawn. For the ambitious, these late hours were a battlefield far more treacherous than any tourney ground. Young knights, eager to climb the social ladder, would linger by the wine table, waiting for a lady of influence to notice them. They spoke in carefully chosen phrases, balancing flattery with wit, hoping to be remembered when a position at court became vacant. Meanwhile, older courtiers, those who had learned the hard way that survival was as much about silence as it was about speaking, watched, listened, and said nothing they didn't mean to say. There were games, of course, both literal and figurative. Tables were cleared for chess, a noble pastime that doubled as a way to demonstrate cunning without shedding blood. But even these friendly matches could determine whether a knight would receive a coveted recommendation, or if a visiting noble would be treated as a trusted ally or a potential threat. A single deliberate mistake, a pawn left unguarded, a rook sacrifice, could be as much a message as a toast at the feast. In the shadows beyond the candlelight, other games unfolded entirely unseen by the highborn. Servants, invisible by design, moved from chamber to chamber, listening without appearing to listen, carrying trays while carrying secrets. A wise lord never underestimated the value of a kitchen boy's gossip or a maid's knowledge of who had slipped into whose chamber after midnight. Some of these servants would trade their knowledge upward, currying favor with their masters. Others kept quiet, biding their time until a piece of overheard scandal could be used for their own small advantage. A better position in the household, a gentler workload, a warm place by the fire when winter came. Not all intrigue was political. The hours after the feast were also when personal dramas played themselves out in slow, deliberate movements. An arranged marriage might be maneuvered into or out of through calculated conversation. Two lovers forbidden by circumstance could exchange a handful of words that meant everything to them and nothing to anyone else. A jealous rival could plant a seed of doubt in the mind of a lord's favorite by remarking on a chance encounter earlier in the day. And then there were the darker games, plots that would never be spoken of in daylight. Poison wasn't just a tool of assassination, it was a tool of intimidation. Rumors would spread about a guest who fell ill after a feast, about the strangely bitter taste of a certain goblet of wine. These murmurs, true or not, reminded everyone that the warmth of candlelight could turn cold in an instant. But perhaps the most unsettling element of Castle Nights was the knowledge that not all games were known to everyone playing. A courtier might believe they were skillfully manipulating a conversation, unaware that they themselves were a piece on someone else's board. The only certainty was that nothing happened in isolation. A joke told here might be repeated in another chamber, its meaning twisted. A promise made in good faith could be turned into a trap with just the right audience. In the midst of all this, the physical space of the castle itself became part of the game. Certain staircases offered quick, discreet access between chambers. Alcoves provided the perfect place to exchange a quiet word, or to eavesdrop without being seen. The flicker of a torch might reveal a shadow slipping past, only to vanish around a corner. And through it all, music drifted. A lute plucking gently in a far hall, the soft hum of a love song carried on the air. On the surface, these moments looked like leisure, a gathering of noble souls enjoying wine and company. But beneath it lay a constant undercurrent of maneuvering, a web of favors owed, loyalties tested, and risks taken. The common people outside the castle walls might have imagined that once the doors were closed and the fires stoked, the nobles retired to peaceful, restful nights. In truth, the night hours could be the most dangerous of all, not because of marauding armies or wild beasts, but because of the very people who sat smiling at one another in the candlelight. In the game of power after dark, you could never be sure who was friend, who was foe, and who was simply waiting for the right moment to decide. The only certainty was that if you didn't play, you would be played. And in a medieval castle, no one could afford to lose. If you've ever walked through the corridors of a medieval castle during the day, you'd think you'd seen it all: stone arches, heavy oak doors, the occasional tapestry to soften the drafts. But at night, these same corridors transformed into something far stranger. The stones themselves seemed to whisper. Shadows stretched and shrank like living things. The sound of footsteps, sometimes yours, sometimes not, carried in ways that made you question how far away the source really was. Every castle worth its salt had secret passageways. Some were designed with noble intentions, escape routes in case of siege, or hidden stairwells so servants could move unseen. But others existed for reasons best not discussed in daylight. In the high towers and behind the walls of great halls were narrow, twisting corridors, barely wide enough for a single person, winding like veins through the stone. These were places where the walls sweated in the cold, where the air was stale from centuries of disuse, and where the occasional rat would dart past like an arrow of fur. Not all of these passages were on the official plans. Some were accidents of construction, spaces left behind when two walls didn't quite meet, or abandoned scaffolding shafts later sealed at one end. Others were deliberate additions. A duke with a jealous streak might commission a hidden stair to his mistress's chamber, ensuring her company without the awkwardness of crossing the courtyard under the watchful eyes of his household. Likewise, a scheming courtier might know of a forgotten spy hole into the council chamber, allowing them to listen to conversations that could tip the balance of power in their favor. Night was when these passages came to life. Servants who had been invisible during the day now became shadow couriers, carrying trays of wine, letters sealed with wax, or whispered messages from one room to another. The stone corridors echoed faintly with their bare or slippered feet, the sound swallowed by the thickness of the walls. Sometimes they were in the service of romance, a clandestine meeting arranged between a bored noblewoman and a troubadour bold enough to risk his neck for a few hours of stolen affection. Other times, the errands were more sinister. Messages could carry poison in words just as easily as in goblets. The more elaborate castles had tunnels that led outside the walls entirely. These postern passages might open behind a thicket or at the edge of a riverbank, far from the main gate. Under the cover of darkness, these became the arteries of illicit trade. Barrels of smuggled wine brought in without paying the duke's tax, sacks of stolen grain whisked away before the steward could notice, or even a visiting knight who found it more convenient to enter unnoticed than to face the prying questions of the gate guards. Not everyone in the castle knew of these routes, of course. Secrets about them were guarded jealously, often passed down from one trusted servant to another, or kept entirely within the ruling family. Knowledge of a secret passage was power, and in a place where survival often depended on knowing things before others did, that knowledge was worth more than gold. Yet sometimes that knowledge led to trouble. Imagine, a servant girl slips through a passage late at night to deliver a note. She hears voices, familiar ones. Peering through a gap in the wall, she sees her lord speaking in low tones with a man she knows is his sworn enemy. The next day, the man is invited to hunt in the forest. The day after that, he is never seen again. The girl keeps the memory to herself, but it weighs on her every time she hears footsteps in that corridor again. Even the nobility used these routes when circumstances demanded discretion. The same duke who paraded at feasts in crimson velvet might slip down a hidden stair to avoid a drunken cousin in the great hall, or to reach a private chamber without attracting attention. Some of these chambers were designed for secret councils. A small room with a single candle, walls thick enough to muffle every word, the perfect place to plan either a rebellion or a romance. One particularly unsettling feature of some castles was the whispering gallery. These curved corridors or domed rooms were constructed in such a way that a person standing at one end could hear a whisper from the other. This wasn't always intentional, but once discovered, such spaces became highly valuable for both eavesdropping and spreading carefully chosen rumors. Imagine walking alone at night, thinking yourself unobserved, and suddenly hearing your own name hissed faintly in the air, not from a ghost, but from someone testing the acoustics a corridor away. But secret passages were not all cloak and dagger. Sometimes they were downright domestic. Servants used them to move chamber pots without offending delicate noses in the main hall. They ferried trays of steaming bread from kitchens to private rooms before the loaves cooled. They kept warm cloaks hidden near exits so that their masters could make a quick escape into the night without alerting the rest of the household. The danger of these spaces, however, was not only in who might overhear or intercept you. The passages themselves were treacherous. Without light, they were pitch black, and more than one unwary traveler had broken an ankle on uneven stone steps or vanished entirely into an unmarked drop. The air could turn stifling in summer, and in winter, cold seeped into the bones. Some passageways had been abandoned for decades, with sections collapsed or filled with rubble, making them deadly to the curious. And then there were the rumors. Every castle had them, whispers of a ghostly procession that moved through the walls at night, or a disembodied voice that called names in the dark. Servants claimed to feel a sudden chill when passing a certain junction, or to smell something strange, smoke, roses, blood, with no visible source. Whether these tales were born of imagination, boredom, or something less explainable, they only added to the passage's mystique. In truth, the secret passage was a perfect metaphor for life in a castle after dark, narrow, twisting, full of shadows, and leading you to places you didn't expect. The path might take you to a lover's embrace or to the threshold of treachery. You might carry a tray, a letter, or simply a dangerous thought. And all the while, the stone walls closed in, holding centuries of secrets in their cold embrace. By the time dawn crept in and the main corridors filled again with polite chatter and the shuffle of daytime chores, the secret passages fell silent. Their doors, hidden behind panels or draped tapestries, were once again part of the scenery. The castle returned to its orderly rhythm, and no one asked how the goblet of wine appeared in a chamber where no servant had been seen, or how a visitor slipped away before breakfast without passing the guards. Those were night questions, and in a medieval castle, night questions were better left unanswered. The great hall of a medieval castle was the stage upon which daylight displayed its most formal grandeur. Banquets, proclamations, court hearings, all the pageantry of feudal life played out here beneath timbered ceilings and flickering chandeliers of tallow candles. But once the daylight receded, and the last goblets had been drained, the hall did not simply become an empty shell. It transformed, quietly but unmistakably, into something else entirely. The servants were the first to return, their steps muffled on the rushes. They moved in practiced silence, clearing away the remnants of the feast. Trencher bread hardened to a crust, the half-gnawed bones of roast boar, the strange orange glow of a cheese rind left too long in the heat, all swept away into baskets to be carried down into the kitchens or tossed to the dogs in the courtyard. The smell of wine lingered, sour and rich, woven into the air like a second tapestry. This was the scent the stone itself seemed to exhale at night, as if the walls had drunk along with the lords. When the nobles slipped away to their chambers, the hall belonged briefly to the lowest ranks of the household. Pages, squires, scullions, they lingered, not daring to sit at the lord's table, but gathering in shadowed corners to trade gossip, to share an illicit jug of ale left unclaimed. By candlelight, the hierarchy softened. A kitchen maid might flirt with a squire. A laundress might tell a tale about the lady's undergarments in scandalous detail. They knew the walls had ears, but in that hour, the walls were listening more lazily than usual. Sometimes, though, the hall hosted more than idle talk. On nights when visiting nobles were lodged in the castle, political currents ran beneath the surface of every whispered word. Messengers might be summoned in secret, entering through side doors that bypassed the guardroom. Letters sealed in wax could be passed hand to hand under the pretense of refilling a goblet. The day's negotiations, the ones done in polite Latin over roasted venison, were often less consequential than the midnight exchanges, where real alliances were sealed or shattered. Then there were the musicians. Officially, they played during feasts or festivals. Unofficially, some were known to slip into the hall after hours, especially if there was a patron with a purse full of silver and a thirst for one more song. The lute's strings sounded softer at night, the notes falling like moths into the warm air. A nobleman might pull his cloak tighter around him, half in shadow, and request a ballad not fit for public ears. The bards, ever adaptable, knew a great deal more than they sang in daylight. But the most curious thing about the Great Hall after midnight was how it blurred the boundaries between the castle's roles. In daylight, it was a political arena. By night, it could be a marketplace of secrets, a theater for forbidden romances, or a backdrop for petty theft. Servants learned to read the signs. A certain noble lingering too long near the sideboard, a guest servant carrying a parcel suspiciously small and heavy, a guard stationed not by the door but beside the tapestry where the wall was known to hide a narrow stair. That stair was the real artery of the castle's midnight life. Few spoke of it openly, but most knew it was there. Behind the woven huntsman chasing the stag, the narrow door opened onto a spiraling path downward, or upward, depending on one's errand. A lady might descend it in a hooded cloak to meet a lover below. A messenger might climb it to deliver a coded letter to the Lord's private study. And occasionally, in the small hours, someone might vanish into it and not be seen again until morning, if at all. On certain winter nights, the Great Hall became a refuge for those not privileged enough to have their own heated chambers. Pages would huddle together near the embers of the central hearth, their cloaks drawn over their heads, breathing in rhythm with the slow burn of the logs. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, but in the hall, there was at least the illusion of safety. This, too, was a kind of intrigue, the quiet survival of those who kept the castle running, the ones who were never invited to the banquet tables but who knew every word spoken there. And so the Great Hall after midnight was both more and less than it appeared. More dangerous because truth moved here without ceremony. Less grand because the candlelight revealed stains the daylight ignored, in the rushes on the tablecloth, in the reputations of those who slipped in and out without record. It was the place where the castle's heartbeat slowed, but never fully slept, where the air seemed thicker, the shadows heavier, and the difference between ally and enemy could be measured in the angle of a glance. By morning, all would be swept away, the rushes replaced, the tables reset, the gossip buried under the polite language of the day. But the Great Hall would remember. Stone always remembers, and those who moved through it in the midnight hours knew, whether they admitted it or not, that this was when the castle was most alive. Not in the blare of trumpets or the clink of goblets, but in the half-whispered phrases and the silent agreements sealed with nothing more than a nod in the dark. The castle, in daylight, was a monument to order. Guards stood to attention in their gleaming armor, servants bustled with trays, and courtiers rehearsed their compliments like actors before a play. But once the sun gave way to the deep blue hush of night, the tapestry-lined corridors became a stage for a far more private theater, one not found in the official annals of the realm. Those tapestries, with their grand scenes of hunts and battles, were more than decoration. Many concealed narrow passageways, the kind that could make a person appear in or vanish from a room without the sound of a single footstep. The stone behind the woven wool was cold and damp, but the usefulness of these secret arteries was priceless. Messengers carrying love notes, servants bearing food to a lover's chamber, and even the occasional jealous noble slipping into place to eavesdrop, all passed along these hidden veins of the castle's body. The tales whispered down these passages were, perhaps, more intoxicating than the finest wine stored in the cellars below. Lady Isabel, for instance, whose beauty was said to be the ruin of 3 men, was known to meet her knightly paramour in the chamber behind the library. The entrance was disguised as a panel of books. Push in the one with the worn leather spine, and the wall would yield like a servant bowing to his mistress. It was here that she and her knight, Sir Roland, met on moonless nights, their stolen hours illuminated only by the dull glow of embers from a brazier. Not all the stories were romantic. Some were cruel, tinged with fear. Spies thrived in the labyrinth of a castle. A servant girl might be coaxed into revealing the Lord's plans for the harvest, or bribed to slip a vial of something bitter into the goblet of a rival. In one particularly grim winter, when food stores ran low, the whispers told of a steward who locked the pantry and rationed bread for the poor while secretly sending roasted meat to a lady he hoped to impress. Such power games were not played in open halls. They belonged to the shadowed spaces where no torchlight reached. Even the tapestries themselves carried hidden language. They were often woven with symbolic flowers or animals, chosen not by accident but as coded messages to the knowing eye. A rose might be stitched not for beauty but to declare a clandestine love. A hawk could be a warning. In some halls, the heraldic beasts weren't merely part of the castle's identity. They were an intimate commentary, as sharp and pointed as any gossip traded between maids in the laundry room. The guards, too, were part of this after-dark network. By day, they were loyal to the Lord. By night, their loyalties could be more flexible. A silver coin or the promise of an introduction to a certain kitchen maid might persuade a guard to look the other way as a cloaked figure slipped by. Some were active participants in the drama, running errands for ladies who could not be seen carrying letters, or escorting lovers across dangerous courtyards at midnight. and if asked the next morning, they would swear nothing at all had happened. One might think these night games belonged only to the young and reckless, but age, in a castle, did not quench desire or ambition. It only taught better ways to hide it. Old courtiers, gray-haired and stooped, might shuffle past you in the corridor with an expression of sleepy innocence, but behind their measured steps could lie an entire night of quiet plotting. They had learned that the true power in a castle often rested not with the sword, but with the whispered word carefully placed. And yet, for all the shadows and intrigue, there was also a strange beauty to it. The air in the hidden halls smelled faintly of dust and lavender from the tapestries, and every whisper, every muffled laugh or soft footstep, was part of a grand, unrecorded symphony. This was the castle's heartbeat after dark, steady, secret, and never meant for daylight's harsh gaze. Sometimes, in the stillest part of the night, when even the rats had gone quiet, a solitary figure would move along these passages without any destination at all. Perhaps it was a servant, too restless to sleep, or a scribe chasing inspiration. Perhaps it was the Lord himself, checking on the hidden mechanisms of his power. Whoever they were, they walked with the knowledge that they were stepping through the true history of the castle, not the history sung by minstrels in the great hall, but the one stitched between the threads of its tapestries. What was spoken in these shadowed spaces rarely reached the world outside. And yet, from these invisible conversations came alliances, betrayals, marriages, duels, and even wars. The candlelit bedchambers, the hollow-sounding stairs, the quiet alcoves behind the woven scenes. They were the hidden parliament of the castle after dark. If you listen long enough, you might hear the truth about who really ruled. It was not always the crowned head on the throne. Sometimes it was the woman who knew which tapestry to slip behind, and whose name to speak once she was there. There was a moment, deep into the night, when the castle itself seemed to exhale. The revelry in the great hall had long since faded into silence, the last notes of the lute curling into the rafters like wood smoke. The kitchens, once clattering with pans and laughter, now slept under the low breathing of banked fires. It was the hour when a single candle could keep the darkness at bay, and when the castle's remaining wakeful souls became part of a much smaller, stranger world. This was the hour of the candle's last inch, a time when the light bent low, trembling, before surrendering to the dark. For most, it meant nothing more than sleep, but for others, it was the preferred hour to do what could not be done by day. Take, for instance, the castle scribes. By day, their work was an unending tide of charters, decrees, and letters, all signed, sealed, and dispatched with the pomp that came naturally to the ruling class. But at night, their quills danced to different music. In the wavering light, they copied poetry that would never bear their name, chronicled scandals in ink they pretended not to have, or forged documents for a fee paid discreetly in small pouches of coin. In the deep stillness, the scratch of a pen became as loud as a confession. The candle's last inch was also the hour of the solitary watcher, the guard assigned to walk the walls under the pale watch of the moon. From up there, the world felt impossibly far away. The forest stretched like an unbroken sea of shadow, and the village below lay in a quilt of sleeping roofs. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl, or the slow creak of leather as the guard shifted his weight. And yet, even here, the mind did not remain idle. A guard might imagine the life of a prince, or the comfort of a warm bed. Or, just as often, he might scheme about selling a piece of information to someone who could make it worth his while. Meanwhile, far below the keep, in the cool dampness of the cellars, another world stirred. Here, in the dark underbelly of the castle, servants moved with the stealth of mice. One fetched a flask of spiced wine for a night's unplanned midnight rendezvous. Another quietly sliced bread and cold meat for a noble who claimed she could not sleep on an empty stomach. The cellars were also the perfect place to speak without being overheard. Stone walls absorbed secrets like thirsty earth, and the smell of casks and salted meat disguised the human scent of conspiracy. It was during these hours that the castle's resident night creatures emerged. Not rats, though they certainly had their share, but people who seemed made for darkness. Some were healers who preferred to work on their patients under candlelight, where the day's distractions could not interrupt them. Others were lovers who moved like shadows between rooms. And then there were those whose purposes were less noble, the pickpockets who prowled the sleeping quarters, the informants who pressed their ears against doors, and the strange solitary figures who wandered without aim, as if sleep were a thing they had forgotten how to do. The chapel, too, took on a peculiar character in the small hours. Its cold stone seemed almost tender in the moonlight filtering through the high windows. This was when the guilty came to pray, hoping that the stillness might amplify their pleas. Sometimes, a knight would kneel for an hour, muttering not to God but to the memory of someone lost in battle. Other times, the only visitor was a chambermaid, barefoot and pale, whispering a promise she dared not speak aloud in daylight. There were also those who sought the stars. The castle's highest towers were rarely visited at night, except by astronomers or, more accurately, men who called themselves astronomers but whose real interest lay in mapping the passage of time for purposes less academic. They would stand for hours, cloaks wrapped tightly, gazing upward as if the heavens might one day spill their secrets. And perhaps, in a way, they did. The moon's slow travel across the sky was a clock for those with nowhere else to be. But the candle's last inch was not only for the plodding, the guilty, or the sleepless. It also belonged to the castle dreamers, the handful of souls who found the darkness beautiful. They might be found leaning out of narrow windows, breathing in the cold air, or sitting alone in some high chamber, listening to the wind worry at the shutters. These were the ones who could feel the castle breathing with them, who heard in its silence not loneliness but the deep hum of a life too vast to grasp. The strange thing about this hour was how quickly it passed. The flame, after burning so patiently, would give a final sputter, then die, leaving the room in thick, living dark. In that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. The night creatures froze mid-step, the lovers parted with a last hurried kiss. The guard on the wall scanned the horizon one final time. And then, as if summoned, the faintest gray began to bleed into the sky. Dawn was still far off, but the spell was broken. The candle's last inch had burned away, and with it the strange, fragile world that lived only in those moments. By the time the servants began to stir and the first cart creaked into the courtyard from the village, the castle had put its secrets back in their hiding places. Its corridors became orderly once more, its people respectable. But for those who had walked the halls in that hour, or listened to the low voices in the cellars, or knelt in the chapel's silvered gloom, the knowledge remained. The castle they moved through by day was only half of what it was. The other half lived in the hour between night's deep silence and morning's noisy birth, in the hour of the candle's last inch, when every whisper seemed important and every shadow might be someone waiting. And when night fell again, that hour would come once more, patient and inevitable, as constant as the turning of the moon. The only question was who would walk its paths next, and what secrets they might leave behind in the dark. By day, a castle is an orderly place, at least in theory. Stone staircases spiral upward with the cold precision of geometry. Courtyards open onto the sky in a manner that pleases architects and intimidates peasants, and every room has its prescribed function. But after dark, a castle changes. The walls do not move, but they seem to lean closer, as if eager to overhear. A grand hall that hosted sermons or state announcements by day could now witness whispered conversations pressed into its shadowed corners. The stone corridors, meant to be the arteries of a fortress, became arteries of something less militaristic: desire, curiosity, danger. Tonight, we linger in those corridors. It is a curious fact that many medieval castles contained hidden architectural features, not because the original masons were being especially clever, but because the needs of power often required privacy and secrecy. The most obvious example was the postern door, a small, concealed entrance in the curtain wall, usually meant for sending out messengers or slipping in spies. But these doors were also convenient for less official purposes. Imagine the possibilities. A nobleman's late-night visitor avoiding the front gate entirely, a servant smuggling out love letters, or a tryst arranged so secretly that only the owls in the battlements bore witness. Then there were the spiral staircases, not just engineering marvels but instruments of strategy and, occasionally, romance, built to favor a right-handed defender coming down, forcing an ascending attacker to wield his sword awkwardly. They also provided a theatrical kind of intimacy. Two people meeting in such a narrow twist of stone could not pass without a brush of cloak against sleeve, the faint catch of perfume in the air. For those with less honorable intentions, stairwells served another function entirely. They allowed you to vanish. Step quickly, duck into an alcove, wait until the footsteps pass. Whether you were avoiding an irate spouse, a suspicious guard, or a rival in love. And then there were the rooms within rooms. Some chambers, particularly in royal apartments, were connected by discreet garderobe passages, narrow walkways meant to access the castle's privies. These were not the romantic spaces of fairy tales, but they provided perfect cover for movement after hours. One could slip quietly between rooms under the excuse of seeking the latrine, and end up somewhere entirely different, say, in the bedchamber of someone who had not expected company. Perhaps the most intriguing were the false walls and concealed stairways, not common, but not unheard of. Certain lords, especially in more paranoid or politically dangerous courts, had these features built to ensure quick escape in the event of a siege, or quick concealment in the event of an indiscretion. Imagine the scene. A nobleman's wife hears the heavy boots of her husband in the hallway. She signals to her guest, perhaps a visiting minstrel, perhaps a young squire, and he disappears behind a wall panel, vanishing into the skeleton of the castle itself, while she calmly adjusts her hair before the door opens. It was not only the nobility who made use of such spaces. Servants knew the castle's arteries better than anyone. They could slip between floors unseen, deliver food to secret meetings, or act as intermediaries for whispered messages. A kitchen boy might carry a tray not to the high table but to a side chamber where two cloaked figures bent over a map, or bent toward each other. A laundress might linger too long near the bath chamber, not from laziness, but because she was delivering a token, a ring, a folded scrap of parchment, a lock of hair bound in ribbon. And then there were the rooftops. By day, the battlements were the domain of guards, but at night, under a canopy of stars, they became something else entirely. Lovers met here in the bite of cold wind, speaking in low voices between the crenellations. Couriers arrived silently by rope, pulling themselves over the parapet like cats. Some even claimed that the wind on the battlements carried away secrets, that what was whispered up there could never reach the ears of those below. A useful superstition for those with much to hide. But the heart of midnight intrigue often lay in the great hall itself. After the evening meal and the dismissal of servants, the massive space would empty, almost. A musician might linger, plucking a quiet tune as if practicing, when in fact he was waiting for someone. A lone torch guttering in its bracket might mark the spot where an assignation would take place. And there was the fire, the great hearth still glowing, its light licking the floor. Those embers bore witness to more than warmth. They illuminated private exchanges, deals sealed by a clasp of hands in the half-light, or eyes meeting across the shadowed expanse. The castle's architecture did not merely house intrigue, it enabled it. Every feature, from the smallest arrow slit to the grandest spiral staircase, was a potential accomplice in whatever drama unfolded. The irony, of course, was that these structures were built to project strength, order, and control, yet the very complexity that kept enemies out also gave cover to those plotting from within. In a way, the Masons of the Middle Ages were unwitting authors of love stories, betrayals, and midnight conspiracies. Their stonework provided the stage, but the players were the courtiers, knights, servants, and secret lovers who moved through the set after the audience had gone home. By morning, the castle would be once again a fortress of law and protocol. The same corridors that had heard breathless whispers would now ring with the clank of armor and the barked orders of captain. But somewhere, perhaps behind a carved panel in a lord's chamber, or beneath the wooden boards of a narrow stair, traces of the night's secrets remained. A forgotten ribbon, a faint scent of rosemary, a wax seal broken and discarded. The daylight could not erase them entirely. And for those who lived within these walls, the knowledge was intoxicating. Every stone was both protection and temptation. In the end, a castle after dark was not simply a building. It was a co-conspirator. By day, the servants were nearly invisible. They moved with quiet efficiency, as though trained to be part of the furniture. A courtier might pass one a dozen times without truly seeing them, except perhaps to bark an order or complain about the temperature of a wine cup. But after the great hall emptied and the last echoes of the day's business dissolved into the stone, the servants' world came alive. It was a parallel universe within the castle, a realm without gilded banquets or embroidered silk, but with its own hierarchies, dramas, and strange amusements. The noble guests never saw it, but the servants carried stories in their heads sharper than any court gossip, and much more dangerous if whispered to the wrong ear. In this hidden night world, work never stopped. Fires had to be stoked before the embers died, chamber pots emptied with military regularity, and the corridors swept before dawn as if the castle had cleaned itself by magic. But alongside this constant motion, something else was happening. A steady, unspoken exchange of glances, favors, and whispered alliances. For servants were not merely cogs in a machine. They were the castle's nervous system. They carried trays and laundry, but also information, overheard fragments of conversations, the names muttered in sleep, the slight tremor in a lord's voice when speaking to a certain lady. They noticed the letter hidden under a pillow, the extra wine sent to a guest's chamber, the boots that left in the night and returned before dawn. They might not speak of it aloud, but they remembered everything, and they had their own loves and lies too. A maidservant might slip away for a stolen kiss in the buttery, timing it between the rounds of the watchman. A stable boy might linger in the warmth of the kitchen under the pretense of fetching water, waiting for a certain cook's apprentice to turn and smile. Theirs was a love lived in moments, a glance as they passed on the stairs, a pressed hand in the shadows, because time for more was a luxury they did not have. Then there were the feuds. Servants could despise each other with the kind of quiet, lifelong hatred that nobles reserved for rival kingdoms. A careless remark about someone's family, a stolen loaf of bread, or a misplaced needle could ignite years of subtle sabotage. Linen starched too stiff, boots cleaned imperfectly, doors closed a second too soon in someone's face. These battles were rarely open, but they were as real as any fought on a battlefield. By midnight, when the noble world was deep in dreams or whispered conspiracies, the servants' quarters would still hum. The lower kitchens glowed faintly from the last fire, and the air was thick with the scent of baking bread for the coming day. In some corners, a group would gather around a candle, mending garments while exchanging stories, a strange mix of bawdy humor, superstitions, and practical advice. One story might be of the ghost in the West Tower, a maid who swore she saw a pale figure carrying a lantern on a moonless night. Another might recount how the master-at-arms once tripped on his own sword belt in the Great Hall, a tale passed down and embellished until it was practically a heroic saga of incompetence. And always there was talk of the lords and ladies, not the polite, empty talk of the Great Hall, but the raw, unfiltered truth as the servants saw it. They knew whose marriage was hollow, whose debts were mounting, and whose jewelry had mysteriously changed ownership. They knew when a visiting knight spent a little too long in the company of a certain married lady. They knew when the steward's ledger did not match the wine cellar. They knew far more than they ever said, and sometimes that silence was their greatest currency. But secrets are dangerous things, and in the castle's shadow world, they could be used like weapons. A kitchen boy who knew too much about his master's late-night meetings might suddenly find himself promoted or sent away. A laundress who discovered an incriminating letter might receive gifts of fine fabric or vanish entirely, her absence explained away as visiting family. The danger made the work heavier, but also gave it a strange thrill. For all the servants' lack of official power, they sometimes held more leverage than they realized. The right word in the right ear could change a fortune. The wrong word could end a life. It is easy to imagine that the servants resented their masters, and sometimes they did. But more often, the relationship was far stranger. There was loyalty born of years in service. There was affection, even pride in a household's reputation. A good master could inspire fierce devotion, just as a cruel one could provoke quiet rebellion. In either case, the bond was more complicated than the ledgers would suggest. By the darkest hour of the night, perhaps just before the first rooster's call, the servants would have already put in more hours than most nobles would in a week. Yet even then, there were moments to breathe. Standing in a quiet corridor, watching the faint shimmer of moonlight on the courtyard snow, or leaning in the open doorway of the kitchen, feeling the warmth against the chill seeping through the stone. These were the tiny luxuries they took for themselves. And perhaps, in those moments, they dreamed of other lives, of owning a stall in the market or traveling with a caravan, or one day running a household of their own. Or maybe they dreamed of nothing at all, too tired for even that. The night in the servants' world was not a place for idle fantasies, but sometimes they crept in anyway. When dawn began to stir at the castle's edges, there was no trumpet call for the servants, no grand breakfast, no ceremony. They simply moved seamlessly into the day's work, as though the night had never happened. And the nobles, emerging from their warm chambers, would find everything in its place. The floors swept, the fires lit, the rooms aired, as if by magic. It was not magic. It was the quiet, tireless work of people whose lives were stitched invisibly into the castle's own heartbeat. And though history rarely names them, they were the ones who truly kept the walls standing. The nobles ruled the day, but the servants, the invisible, ever-watching, ever-moving servants, ruled the night. In the heart of a medieval feast, there is always one cup that feels heavier than the others. Not because of the wine inside, but because of the hands that pour it. Castles after dark were not only dens of whispered romance and late-night laughter, they were hunting grounds for ambition. And in the shadowed corners of the Great Hall, the most dangerous weapons were not swords or daggers, but goblets. A poisoned cup could end a dynasty in a heartbeat, And the beauty of poison, at least from the perspective of the one wielding it, was its silence. It did not clang against armor. It did not scream in the night. It simply drifted into the veins of the unsuspecting and claimed them without so much as a drawn blade. After dark, the castle kitchens could become an alchemist's lab. Herbs and spices, ostensibly for flavor, were sorted with suspicious care. A dash of nutmeg could mask the bitterness of certain powders. Honeyed wine could hide the earthy tang of ground-up plants better left in the garden. Not every cook was a conspirator, of course, but every servant knew. In a household full of enemies, a careless hand with the ladle could cost lives. Servants, in fact, were often the silent participants in these dramas. They knew which goblet belonged to whom. They knew who drank red wine, who drank white, who preferred ale, and who preferred to keep their lips dry during the night. This knowledge, banal in daylight, became dangerous in candlelight. The wrong servant, in the wrong mood, could change the fate of an entire court simply by accidentally handing the wrong drink to the wrong person. Poison itself had many faces in the Middle Ages. There was arsenic, the inheritance powder whispered about in Italy, slipped into stews or sweet pastries. There was hemlock, bitter and unmistakable, unless buried beneath a rich meat broth. Belladonna, beautiful and deadly, could make pupils dilate into a captivating darkness right before the victim collapsed. Some poisons worked instantly, producing dramatic collapses in the Great Hall. Others were slow, cruel, gnawing at the body over weeks, making the illness look natural to all but the most suspicious eyes. After a suspected poisoning, the castle might come alive with fevered investigation. Not by trained detectives, of course, those were centuries away, but by a combination of gossip, superstition, and raw paranoia. Cups might be dipped in holy water, kitchens searched for cursed herbs, and servants interrogated until dawn. Sometimes the wrong person was punished. Sometimes no one was punished at all, and life went on, because in the end, many poisons were as invisible as the intentions behind them. The most skilled poisoners were never caught. They did not merely wait for opportunity, they crafted it. A long banquet gave them time. The arrival of a visiting noble created perfect chaos in the kitchens. And the most subtle of all would not kill with a single dose, but introduce their poison slowly, day after day, until the victim became weaker and weaker, eventually succumbing to what everyone assumed was God's will. And it wasn't just nobles who lived with this fear. In the servants' hall, a poorly timed insult could mean your next mug of ale was more than just barley and water. Poison was the great equalizer. It did not care about rank, only about access. The maid who cleaned the chalices, the boy who refilled the pitchers, the guard who fetched wine for the night on duty, all could be accomplices, willing or not. There was also the curious belief in protective charms against poison. Nobles would drink from cups made of horn, silver, or even carved from unicorn tusks, though most of these unicorn horns were narwhal tusks brought from faraway seas. It was said these could sweat or change color in the presence of poison. Sometimes a gemstone was set into the goblet, believed to absorb the deadly substance before it reached the lips. Whether these worked or not was questionable, but they made the drinker feel safer, and in a world where trust was rare, feeling safe was sometimes more important than actually being safe. And here is the strangest truth of all. Despite the fear, despite the whispered warnings, the toasts continued. Cups were raised high in the flickering torchlight. Laughter rang through the halls. The wine was poured, and lips met the rim, every sip a silent gamble. Because in castles after dark, to refuse a drink was more suspicious than to accept one. And so they drank, sometimes to their health, sometimes to their death, while the music played on. The poisoner's cup is one of those quiet symbols of medieval life that never truly left us. It is the embodiment of courtly danger. The idea that danger doesn't always roar in with a drawn sword. It can be passed to you with a smile, in a golden goblet, under the soft glow of candlelight. And by the time you taste its truth, it's already too late. Every castle had rooms no one was meant to enter. Not because they were locked, though some were, but because they were wrapped in layers of unspoken warning. A certain corridor avoided by servant. A heavy oak door that never seemed to open, yet was always kept in perfect repair. During the day, these chambers might be passed without a thought. But at night, when the torches burned low and the hallways filled with silence, they seemed to draw the eye. It was as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. Some forbidden chambers were truly dangerous. Storerooms for weapons, armories crammed with crossbows and spears, doors sealed with iron to keep curious hands away. The Lord's treasury, filled with silver plate and strongboxes, was locked behind bars thick enough to discourage even the most confident thief. The key to such rooms was rarely carried on a ring. It was kept in a pouch worn under the lord's tunic or hung around the neck of his most trusted steward. Others were forbidden for reasons more delicate. A guest room once occupied by someone who never left alive. A nursery where the air still smelled faintly of lavender, though no child had slept there for years. Or the personal chamber of the lady of the castle, where certain drawers and chests were locked not against theft, but against discovery. And then there were the places that seemed to serve no purpose at all. Narrow spiral staircases leading to small, empty rooms with windows too narrow for a person to pass through. Spaces so awkwardly shaped they seemed designed for something secret. Some of these odd chambers were indeed meant for defense, murder holes, spy points, and hidden shooting platforms. Others were built for meetings no one was meant to witness, lit by a single candle and muffled by thick walls. Servants traded stories about what went on in these rooms after dark. Some claimed the Lord met his closest advisors there to discuss matters of treason. Others whispered about trysts between members of the household who would never dare meet openly. A few swore these chambers were not used by the living at all, that ghosts walked there, guarding their secrets from the grave. And sometimes, forbidden meant cursed. Medieval people believed certain rooms could trap bad fortune, like a barrel holding stagnant water. To enter was to risk carrying that misfortune away with you. Even the bravest guards would hesitate to step inside such places without a blessing from the castle priest. The truly dangerous chambers, however, were those that looked ordinary. The ones tucked behind the Lord's bedchamber or hidden inside a tower wall. These were escape rooms, war rooms, or hidden passages to the outside world, known only to a handful of people, each sworn to secrecy. They were designed to vanish from memory when not needed. Of course, some secrets refused to stay hidden. Servants carrying laundry up the wrong stair might stumble on a doorway they'd never seen before. A mason repairing a wall might discover a hollow space where a passage had been bricked over. And once knowledge like that escaped into the open, the chamber could never be truly forbidden again. The irony of these rooms was that their secrecy depended entirely on trust, and castles, for all their high walls, were not places built on trust. Every door closed too tightly bred suspicion. Every whisper behind a locked door added fuel to the fire. And yet, without such places, the delicate web of medieval power would collapse. Secrets had to live somewhere. If you were a guest in such a castle, you might never know you slept only a few steps away from one of these chambers. You might sit in the great hall, sipping wine, while just above your head, a council plotted the next war, or a prisoner sat in darkness, or a chest of forbidden documents waited for the wrong hands to find it. Because in the medieval world, a castle was never just a home, it was a maze. And within that maze were rooms where the truth itself was kept under lock and key. Rooms that waited, patient and silent, for the moment someone dared to turn the handle. Guards were the breathing walls of a medieval castle, not made of stone, but of muscle, habit, and suspicion. They were the thin layer of living iron between the Lord's comfort and whatever the world outside wanted to throw at him. Be it an army, a dagger, or an inconvenient truth, they were posted everywhere. At the gates, on the ramparts, by the treasury, at the door of the Lord's bedchamber. Some stood so long in the same place that their shadows seemed part of the masonry. Their faces were rarely seen without a helmet, though if you did catch a glimpse, you might notice the expression of someone who was half watching for enemies and half calculating how many hours remained until the next meal. On paper, a guard's job was simple: keep watch. In practice, it was a slow-motion game of survival. The night watch, in particular, was an exercise in keeping your mind awake while the rest of the world tried to seduce it into sleep. In the biting cold, guards stamped their feet and whispered to one another in low voices that carried strangely along the stone corridors. In the summer heat, they leaned against doorframes and let their eyes wander to the flicker of distant torches, wondering if they were really guarding anything at all. But it wasn't all monotony. Guards were the castle's nervous system. They carried messages, escorted visitors, and quietly took note of who came and went. They knew which servants slipped away to meet behind the stables, which merchants lingered too long after delivering their goods, and which guests avoided the chapel without a good excuse. And because they were everywhere, they became the custodians of the castle's most delicate knowledge. Not the political decisions, that was for scribes and advisors, but the patterns. They noticed which locked doors were used at odd hours, which tapestries were disturbed, which rooms smelled faintly of smoke though no fire had been lit. Of course, this kind of knowledge could be as dangerous as any weapon. A guard who knew too much could become a threat or a valuable tool. Lords rewarded loyalty with extra pay, better armor, or even small plots of land. But the truly valuable currency was trust, and trust was a slippery thing. A man trusted today might be bribed tomorrow. Some guards were quietly in the pocket of foreign agents, feeding scraps of information in exchange for gold. Others were loyal to the household but not to the person currently in power, a subtle but important distinction. And some simply didn't care so long as they could keep their post and their rations. It was common for guards to double as spies. They could loiter where no one else could, overhear whispers, and read faces. They were sometimes used to deliver messages meant never to be written down, because who would question a man in uniform carrying a sealed pouch? In times of danger, guards were the first to be tested. They had to choose whether to stand their ground, abandon their post, or quietly open a gate when the right signal was given. And when an enemy did get inside, it was often because someone on the inside had decided it was worth letting them in. Still, there was a strange sort of camaraderie among guards. The shared misery of standing watch in the rain. The hushed conversations about whose turn it was to take the high tower shift. The silent understanding that the person next to you might one day have to save your life or take it. By day, they blended into the castle's rhythm, almost invisible in their constancy. But at night, when the halls were empty and the torches burned low, the guards became the castle's only heartbeat. They moved like shadows, spoke in murmurs, and carried the weight of knowing more than they were ever meant to say. And so, while their job title might have been protector, their true role was far more complicated. They were watchers of people, keepers of secrets, and silent judges of everyone who passed through the castle's gates. Whether they chose to guard those secrets or trade them away, that was a decision made in the quiet between one footstep and the next. When the day's feasting was over and the great hall's long tables stood bare except for the crumbs and grease stains of aristocratic satisfaction, the castle kitchens did not truly rest. The fire in the great hearth still burned low, embers glowing like tired sentinels, and the air still clung to the smells of the day: roasted meat, singed bread, onions that had given up their sharpness to the boiling pot. The kitchen after dark was a place of two worlds: the solemn stillness of the sleeping castle above, and the restless industry of those below who never truly stopped. By daylight, the kitchens were loud and frantic, a symphony of chopping, sizzling, shouting, and the occasional violent crash when some unfortunate boy dropped a pan. But at night it was slower, quieter. The clatter became a shuffle, the voices became whispers, and the work took on a more secretive rhythm. This was the hour for preparation and preservation. Bread dough needed to be kneaded for the morning, barrels of ale topped up and leftovers sorted, some to feed the servants, some to disguise and present again tomorrow, and some destined for the pigs. Nothing was wasted unless it was truly beyond redemption, and even then, the kitchen cats or the yard dogs might be the final recipients. The cook, of course, was still in command. Even in the late hours, she or he was a figure of authority, moving through the dim light with a ladle like a scepter. The cook knew the castle's appetites better than anyone, from the lord's preference for venison with rosemary to the stable boy's habit of sneaking oat cakes when no one was looking. In the quiet hours, the cook's mood could soften. A scrap of cheese here, a ladle of broth there, but always with the understanding that what was given could just as easily be taken away if word got back to the wrong ears. Kitchens were gossip's natural habitat. Here, the scullions scrubbed pans while exchanging theories about who was courting who, which visiting noble had complained about the wine, and whether the steward's new boots had been paid for out of the castle's accounts or quietly gifted by a merchant hoping for favors. Some of it was harmless chatter, and some of it, if overheard, could topple reputations. The kitchen knew everyone's business because everyone passed through it eventually. Visitors who found themselves wandering into the kitchens after dark were rare but not unheard of. A knight returning late might request something warm to drink. A chambermaid might slip in for a slice of bread for a sick friend, or the lord's own children might sneak in barefoot, giggling, in search of honey cakes. The servants were used to this and had an instinct for what to give freely and what to refuse. After all, feeding the wrong person at the wrong time could lead to suspicion of favoritism or worse, theft. And then there was the quiet smuggling. Not grand conspiracies, just the small acts that kept life bearable. A boy might tuck a crust of bread into his sleeve for his mother. A maid might fill a flask with broth for the old man in the village who could no longer chew. Even the cook, fierce as they might seem, often looked the other way so long as no one took more than the kitchen could spare. The kitchen was also the place where the castle's sense converged. the faint, acrid smoke of the fire pit, the sweetness of fruit preserves cooling in their jars, the tang of brine from the barrels where fish floated like pale ghosts, and, underneath it all, the earthy smell of the flagstone floor, worn smooth by centuries of spills and footfalls. At night, the room was lit only by the glow of the hearth and a few guttering candles. Shadows shifted across the walls, making the hanging copper pots gleam dully. You could hear the creak of the wooden tables settling in the cool air, the faint drip of water from a recently scrubbed pan, the rustle of flour sacks as a mouse went about its nightly exploration. The castle above might have been locked in silence, but the kitchens were alive with a softer kind of life, one that did not need fanfare or trumpet calls. It was the heartbeat of the household, steady and unglamorous, sustaining everyone from the highest noble to the lowliest stable hand. And when the final loaf was set to rise, the last pan scrubbed, and the embers banked for the night, the kitchen would finally yield to stillness. The workers would retire to their cramped quarters, smelling faintly of smoke and bread, knowing that in only a few hours, the fires would be stoked again and the great, clattering orchestra of the day would begin anew. For all the glamour that later generations like to imagine about castles, the banners, the armor, the feasts, one stubborn truth remained: water had to come in and waste had to go out. The romantic paintings never seemed to dwell on that part. Let's start with the water. A castle could not survive without a reliable supply, not just for drinking, but for cooking, brewing ale, washing, and, yes, extinguishing fires. Many were built near rivers or springs for that reason, but the most prized feature was a deep well within the castle walls. A good well was as valuable as any battlement. It meant the defenders could endure a siege without having to sneak out and fetch water under enemy fire. These wells were feats of stubborn engineering. Imagine lowering men down into the earth, pickaxes in hand, chipping away at rock by candlelight, hauling bucket after bucket of rubble back up through a narrow shaft. Some wells descended more than 100 feet. The stonework had to be sturdy enough not to collapse, and the rope and pulley system strong enough to bring up heavy buckets without snapping. Water from these wells wasn't always the pristine, crystal-clear mountain spring you might picture. It could be cloudy, it could be flavored by minerals, and on bad days, it could taste faintly of the things that seeped into the ground nearby. People boiled it, mixed it with wine, or simply drank ale instead, which, frankly, was safer. Ale might not quench thirst in the way cold water did, but at least it didn't give you the kind of stomach ailments that could wipe out half a household. If no well was available, there might be a cistern, a great stone tank to collect rainwater from the roofs. Ingenious gutters and lead pipes funneled the runoff into storage. Useful in theory, but after a few weeks without rain, the contents could grow. Interesting. Stagnant water developed a rich bouquet of algae and mosquito larvae, and while boiling could fix the first, the second tended to get strained out rather than destroyed. People in those days were remarkably good at pretending not to notice certain things. And then there was the waste. What went in had to come out, and castles developed a range of solutions, each more inventive than polite company would approve of. The most famous was the garderobe, a narrow room, often tucked into the outer wall, with a bench and a hole leading straight down to the open air. The waste would drop, ideally, into a pit or moat below. This was simple, gravity-powered, and, if the wind was in the wrong direction, capable of scenting the courtyard in ways no tapestry could disguise. Some garderobes emptied into cesspits, which had to be cleaned out periodically. This unenviable job was left to gong farmers, who worked at night and were paid surprisingly well for their willingness to shovel human waste into carts and haul it away. It was dangerous work, not because of marauding enemies, but because the fumes could be toxic in enclosed spaces. People have been known to faint in such pits, which tells you all you need to know about the aroma. Larger castles sometimes had an entire network of latrine shafts, chutes, and drains, an early form of plumbing without the luxury of running water. Rain might help flush things along, but mostly gravity did the work. In winter, this could be treacherous. Frozen waste did not move along nicely. Instead, it stayed exactly where it was, creating a sort of unpleasant archaeological layer until the thaw came. Waste from kitchens and workshops was another matter. Bones, ashes, vegetable peelings, all of it needed to be carried outside. Some of it fed animals, some was dumped into middens, and some was simply tossed over the walls into the nearest ditch. The idea of a neatly contained rubbish system was still centuries away. Of course, all of this made the presence of water even more crucial. Washing hands after visiting the garderobe wasn't quite the cultural standard yet, but washing dishes and scrubbing floors certainly required it. In some castles, a stone basin near the kitchen would be kept full of fresh water, with servants changing it when it became too murky to see the bottom. By the end of the day, the water would be tinged with grease, floating crumbs, and, if you were lucky, only a faint smell of onions. Water also shaped the castle's defenses. Moats, when they contained water at all, could serve as both a barrier and a convenient dumping ground. The romantic notion of a sparkling, lily-dotted moat hides the reality that many were fed by slow, murky streams, and over time, they became open sewers for the community inside the walls. Invaders wading through that water risked more than arrows. The truth was, castles were marvels of survival in hostile times, but they were not immune to the unglamorous needs of human life. Water was fetched, waste was carried, and somewhere, deep in the night, a gong farmer trudged through the shadows, shovel in hand, doing the work no bard ever sang about. If you've ever looked at a medieval tapestry and admired the crisp folds of a noble's linen tunic, you might imagine that laundry in those days was some genteel affair. Maids in spotless aprons, fluttering linens drying in the sun, perhaps a gentle scent of lavender drifting in the air. In reality, it was hard, wet, back-breaking work, usually done by people who had no choice in the matter, and it smelled less like lavender and more like damp wool and old soap. Laundry day wasn't a quaint weekly ritual. It was an ordeal. In fact, many medieval households only tackled it a few times a year. For peasants, this wasn't laziness, it was practicality. Clothes were few, water was heavy to fetch, firewood was expensive, and soap wasn't cheap. The average person wore the same linen shift or shirt for days, even weeks, before it saw a wash. It sounds horrifying to modern ears, but in a world where everyone smelled equally human, it was just life. When it finally came time to wash, the process was slow and deliberate. The first step was soaking the clothes, often in large wooden tubs filled with hot water. If you lived near a river or stream, you might haul everything down there instead, though this came with the risk of losing a sock to the current or worse, having your laundry float away entirely. The soap itself was rarely the pleasant, perfumed bar we picture today. Medieval soap was often made from rendered animal fat mixed with lye, which was produced by pouring water through wood ash. The result was a substance that could remove dirt, but also strip oils from skin and leave hands raw. After a day of scrubbing, washerwomen's hands were often chapped, cracked, and stinging. Gloves weren't a thing. If you wanted protection, you just learned to live with the sting. For stubborn stains, especially from sweat, food, or the mysterious blotches that appeared on children's clothing, people sometimes used fuller's earth, a type of clay, or even urine. Yes, fresh or fermented urine was valued for its ammonia content, which helped whiten linens. Some households actually kept a piss pot specifically for this purpose. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective, and it's the sort of thing no medieval romance novel bothers to mention. Once the clothes were soaped, they were beaten. Literally, wooden paddles, heavy sticks, or even large stones were used to pound the fabric, loosening dirt and, let's be honest, working out a bit of frustration. The rhythmic thumping of laundry day was a familiar sound in villages, and it could carry for quite a distance. Beating laundry was satisfying work, but it was also exhausting, especially when you had sheets, tablecloths, and winter cloaks to deal with. After beating came rinsing. This might involve multiple trips to the river, or pouring bucket after bucket of cold water through the fabric. The rinsing had to be thorough. If soap was left behind, it could stiffen the cloth and irritate the skin. Then came the wringing, which required the strength of a blacksmith's apprentice. Twisting a sheet dry was no delicate act. It was a wrestle between woman and linen, with neither side emerging entirely victorious. Drying the laundry was another challenge. In summer, you could hang things in the sun and hope for a breeze. In winter, clothes were hung indoors near the fire, which made the house humid, smoky, and smelling faintly of boiled socks. In damp weather, laundry might take days to dry, and if it froze outside, you simply had to wait until it thawed again. The idea of a warm, humming machine that could dry your clothes in an hour would have been the stuff of witchcraft. For noble households, laundry was no less laborious, just delegated. Castles had laundry rooms and laundresses whose entire job was to keep the lord's linens in good order. There were strict rules for handling fine fabrics like silk and wool, and certain garments were never fully washed, only brushed and aired. A nobleman's shirts might be boiled in large copper cauldrons, then beaten, rinsed, and laid out on clean grass to bleach in the sun. This bleaching was more for appearances than hygiene. Whiter cloth was a sign of wealth. Still, even in a palace, laundry was a wet, heavy, and unglamorous business. Laundresses worked in steamy rooms, their skirts soaked from splashing water, lifting and wringing fabric until their shoulders ached. They were sometimes paid in leftover food or old clothing, and occasionally, in the rarest of moments, with a half-day off. By the end of a laundry day, the air would be thick with steam, the floor slick with water, and the workers exhausted. The clothes would be clean, yes, but the people doing the washing would be in desperate need of a wash themselves. In that sense, medieval laundry was a never-ending cycle. You cleaned the clothes, you got dirty doing it, and then your own clothes eventually needed washing. The truth was, medieval life didn't allow for much sparkle or crisp cotton freshness. Clothes were kept serviceable, not perfect. A shirt that was clean enough was good enough, and a faint smell of wood smoke was considered almost pleasant. After all, in a world without deodorant, perfume, or modern plumbing, laundry was less about smelling nice and more about not sticking to your own shirt. In the glow of moonlight, castles often appeared serene, their towers silhouetted against the velvet sky, banners hanging limp in the night air, and a hush settling over the courtyards. Yet inside, while lords and ladies dreamed of glory, or at least of warmer blankets, there was another kind of battle unfolding. It was not fought with swords and shields, but with narrowed eyes, whispered rumors, and the occasional accidental spilling of wine. It was the unending, invisible war among the servant. Castles were not just homes to noble families, they were hives. Cooks, laundresses, stable boys, scribes, guards, chambermaids, stewards, each with a hierarchy, a territory, and a long list of grievances. By day, they bustled about under the watchful eye of the master or mistress. By night, freed from the gaze of authority, grudges were pursued with the kind of subtle cruelty only those living in close quarters for years can develop. Take the kitchen, for instance. The cook was the general of that realm, ruling over spits, pots, and endless trays of bread with an iron ladle. But beneath them, apprentices and scullions plotted to shift the cook's favor, or to undermine it entirely. A pinch too much salt in a favored dish, a loaf left just a little too long in the oven. Small acts, plausibly deniable, but satisfying to those who felt slighted. In the great halls, chambermaids played their own quiet games. Bedding could be fluffed to perfection for a favored guest or left suspiciously lumpy for one they disliked. Gossip, too, was a weapon. A maid who overheard a drunken confession from a noble might accidentally repeat it in the laundry room, knowing the echo would eventually reach someone important. The most skilled gossips could destroy a person standing with nothing but a raised eyebrow and a half-heard sentence. Even the guards, often imagined as unified in purpose, were not immune to such rivalries. Night shifts could be swapped as favors or refused as punishment. A guard could conveniently forget to wake his replacement on time, forcing him to endure another freezing hour on the wall. Such slights did not go unnoticed, and the cycle of petty retribution kept turning. And then there were the household stewards, those who controlled supplies, wages, and the allocation of duties. To be on a steward's bad side was to find oneself cleaning latrines for a month or assigned to the coldest, draftiest room in the castle. A clever steward, however, could disguise malice as mere efficiency, making it all but impossible to challenge their decisions. The real genius of these silent wars was how invisible they were to the nobles. Lords and ladies believed their household functioned like a well-oiled machine. Meals served on time, rooms clean, horses ready, without realizing the constant negotiation, manipulation, and sabotage required to maintain that illusion. They noticed only when something truly disastrous happened, like the time a banquet was delayed because the spitboy had accidentally dropped the main roast into the ashes. No one ever admitted the act was deliberate, but everyone in the servant quarters knew exactly whose grudge it served. These midnight intrigues among the lower ranks were not entirely malicious. They were also a form of survival. Servants lived at the mercy of their superiors, and to thrive in such an environment required wit, alliances, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. In the absence of wealth or title, influence was measured in information, knowing who was sleeping with whom, who owed money, whose favor could be won with a gift of candied almonds. Some alliances became so entrenched that they lasted decades, passing from one generation of servants to the next. A maid might be loyal to a kitchen boy not because she liked him, but because their mothers had been allies before them. Likewise, feuds could be inherited, with new servants stepping into old rivalries they barely understood. By the light of the moon, the castle's true pulse could be felt in the whispered conversations by the fire in the servants' hall, the knowing glances exchanged in the corridor, the quiet closing of a door when someone important passed. It was not the clang of swords or the clash of armies that kept the castle alive. It was the constant, invisible maneuvering of the people who scrubbed its floors, lit its fires, and guarded its gates. And perhaps this was the greatest irony of all. While the nobles spun their grand tales of courtly love, heroic deeds, and noble sacrifice, the real intrigue, the kind that could truly change lives, was happening in the unlit corners, over half-empty mugs of ale, between people who would never see their names recorded in history books. But they were the ones who kept the castle turning. And in the deep of night, when the great hall lay silent and only the wind moved through the battlements, their wars raged on, unseen and uninterrupted. Every castle had its public face, grand halls for feasting, chapels for prayer, courtyards for proclamations. But the walls told a different story. Behind their stone facades lay a labyrinth of spaces never marked on any official plan. These were the places that didn't exist, at least not for those who weren't meant to know. Some were born of necessity. Builders in the Middle Ages weren't working from neatly bound architectural blueprints, but from the slow evolution of one idea on top of another. A defensive tower became a storage space, which became an unused room, which someone eventually claimed for more personal purposes. Staircases were built to nowhere, sealed archways hid forgotten corridors, and thick walls concealed slivers of space just wide enough for a person to slip through. And yet, many of these spaces were deliberately designed. Tiny listening rooms hidden near great halls so that someone could eavesdrop without ever being seen. Concealed doorways that allowed a noble to move between their chamber and a lover's without the inconvenience of using the main corridors. In some castles, priests had hidden chapels where secret confessions were whispered and quickly absolved before word could spread. These rooms were not always glamorous. Some were damp little pockets smelling of old mortar and dust. Others were suffocatingly small, with barely enough air to stand in for long. But in the politics of castle life, their value was enormous. To know of a hidden door was to hold a form of power. Servants used them to move unseen, avoiding both the demands of nobles and the rivalries of fellow staff. Smugglers used them to ferry goods in and out, wine, spices, even forbidden books, without attracting attention at the gates. And when danger loomed, these spaces could mean the difference between life and death. A corner of the wall large enough for a single person could hide someone from a searching army. A false fireplace could swing open to reveal a passage that led outside the castle entirely. The nobles, of course, liked to believe they alone commanded knowledge of such places. But in truth, the servant class was far more intimately aware of every draft, creak, and loose stone. If a noblewoman thought she was the only one who knew about the narrow stairwell behind her chambers, she was wrong. At least 3 maids, a stable boy, and the scullery master had used it at some point, often for reasons that would have made her faint. Some castles became notorious for their hidden spaces. In one, there was said to be a single tunnel that could carry a person from the lord's private room to the kitchens without once passing through a main hallway. In another, a concealed gallery allowed someone to watch the great hall from above without being seen, perfect for learning who was speaking to whom during a feast. And then there were the ghost rooms. These were spaces remembered only in whispers, rooms that had been walled off generations ago, often for reasons lost to time. Sometimes a new wall was built to block out a draft. Sometimes it was because of a family scandal, a superstition, or a death that had taken place within. People avoided those areas, not because of ghosts necessarily, but because in a castle, old secrets had a way of resurfacing at the worst possible moments. For children growing up within castle walls, these hidden places became their playground. They dared one another to slip into narrow spaces behind tapestries or to follow a dark corridor until they found its end. Many learned the geography of their home far better than their elders. By the time they were adults, they knew exactly which stairs creaked and which panel in the library could be pressed to reveal a dark crawl space. But as with all things in medieval life, secrecy came with risk. If a noble discovered you had been slipping into their private passageways, your life could become very unpleasant very quickly. A hidden room might be a refuge one day and a trap the next, depending on who held the knowledge of its existence. And yet, the idea of them lingers, those shadowed little spaces where the truth could be overheard, where illicit goods could pass, where a person could simply vanish for a moment and return as if nothing had happened. The stones remembered, the drafts whispered, and somewhere, behind a wall you'd swear was solid, there might still be a place that doesn't exist until you need it. At some point in the long medieval night, the corridors of the castle would fall still. Not the stillness of a world without sound, there was always sound, but the stillness of a world that had tucked its noise into softer pockets. The kitchens, which had earlier been an orchestra of clanging pans, were now dark except for the slow burn of the embers in the hearth. They sighed and cracked occasionally, releasing little curls of smoke that drifted into the rafters. A stray dog, having been shooed away from the tables during supper, now slept curled by the dying fire as if it had been its place all along. In the great hall, the rushes lay scattered where they'd been kicked aside during the evening's feasting. A few goblets and knives still rested on the trestle tables, forgotten by servants who had been too tired, or too superstitious, to return and collect them in the dark. Shadows from the torches along the walls swayed like slow dancers, stretching and shrinking as if they, too, were trying to find rest. Up in the chambers, the lords and ladies had retreated into their curtained beds. Heavy fabric shut out the draught, though not entirely. The stone always held the night's cold, and even with furs piled high, there was no pretending that winter had stayed outside. In these moments, the luxury of wealth was measured not in gold, but in the number of blankets one could gather without being accused of greed. Servants, having finished their work, lay on pallets in narrow rooms above the kitchens or beside storerooms. Here the air was warmer, if tinged with the smell of flour, smoke, and the day's cooking. They slept deeply because tomorrow would come early, and the tasks would be the same. Somewhere in the outer walls, guards walked the parapets, their breath clouding in the cold air. Their boots struck the stone at intervals you could almost set your heartbeat to. They didn't speak much, not because of strict orders, but because speech seemed unnecessary in a world wrapped in darkness. Every so often, a faint hoot of an owl rose from the woods beyond, and the guards would glance at each other, confirming they'd heard it too, just to be sure it wasn't something else. And deep within the castle, below the cellars, past the places even daylight rarely touched, water dripped in slow, patient beats. The stones down here were older than the oldest stories told in the great hall. Sometimes the drafts carried whispers through the cracks, voices that might have been the living or might have been nothing at all. No one stayed in those passages for long after dark, not even the bravest. In the stillness, the castle seemed almost to breathe. Its timbers creaked softly, its walls settled with the faintest groans, as though remembering the weight of every winter, every storm, every siege it had endured. It was the sound of a living thing resting, a creature of stone and wood and memory. Those who woke in the night, whether lord or servant, moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by habit. Perhaps they went to stir the fire, or to check on a restless child, or to step into the corridor just long enough to listen. Not for danger, necessarily, but simply to remind themselves they were not alone inside this vast, sleeping body of a building. And in that hour, the hierarchies of the day dissolved. The lords and the scullery maids, the knights and the stable boys, they all shared the same shadowed quiet, the same cold breath from the stones, the same awareness that the world outside these walls might be cruel, but for now the castle held. When dawn finally began its slow climb, it arrived first as a dim silvering of the highest windows, then as a thin wash of pale light sliding down the walls. The castle stirred, boots on stairs, pots clanging in kitchens, voices returning to the halls. And as the day's noise swelled, the quiet of the night faded into memory, as if it had been a dream that the waking world refused to believe. But the castle remembered, and it would remember again, every night, long after its people were gone.